Hi Year 9, welcome back to the 7th video in this series of lessons on Jekyll and Hyde. In this lesson you will learn about the structure of Victorian society as reflected in Robert Louis Stevenson's strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We're going to talk about three different things again today, so Victorian context, Victorian society and separate spheres in Jekyll and Hyde. Okay, so let's start with Victorian context. So, the Victorian period spanned the reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901. This was a remarkably long reign, second only to Queen Elizabeth II, who is still the monarch today. The Victorian period followed the Romantic period, which was a time of both industry and imagination. Industry and progress also defined the Victorian period, as did the genre of the realist novel, which was extremely popular. Many realist novels came out in serial form, meaning in weekly parts. You might think about it as resembling a kind of pre-Netflix television show. Readers had to wait on cliffhangers to be resolved. So as I go on reading this, I'm just going to carry on putting different key moments in the Victorian period along this timeline. So in the second half of the Victorian period, the Gothic genre re-emerged, perhaps because it was stirred back to life by sensational fiction, which was novels that sought to titillate the reader's senses. Robert Louis Stevenson's strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which was first published in 1886, in many ways inaugurates the return of the Gothic to prominence. Many popular Gothic texts followed, including Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray and Bram Stoker's Dracula. So I'm just going to give you a few more seconds just to copy down this timeline because I think it will be really interesting and important for you to have alongside your revision notes. So school was actually made compulsory only in 1880. Interesting. Okay, so there we have it. We have the key moments between 1837 and 1901, which was the whole Victorian era. Fantastic. So let's move on to Victorian society now. So we're going to zoom in. Victorian society. So, for some time, historians have understood the Victorian period to be the exemplar of the separate spheres, meaning the division of labour between men and women. Generally speaking, men worked outside the home while women laboured in domestic settings. This system often proved disastrous. However, for women who were either abandoned or widowed, women fought throughout the century for more rights, and increasing numbers of women left the home to work, breaking out of their sphere. The other separation to note in the Victorian period is between the rich and the poor. Although the middle class had been increasing in number throughout the 19th century, there was still a prominent division between economic classes. The rich often didn't work at all. Their money came from annuities tied to the family name. Therefore, they had disposable time to learn and to socialise. On the other side, the poor barely scraped by. Many were sent to debtors' prisons, and many families were forced to live in workhouses where conditions were deplorable at best. So beneath England's gentry were professionals. They were highly educated, often either at Oxford or Cambridge, and were either doctors, lawyers, or philosophers. These people socialised together and were just as ostracised from the poor. Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde explores these separations, especially concerning class. So therefore, class is a major theme in this text. I think it would be a really good idea as well to copy down this pyramid, because I think it's a really good visual aid for when you're thinking about Victorian society. Okay, so finally, let's zoom in even further and look at the separate spheres within the text. Okay, the upper crust of Jekyll and Hyde are easy to spot. The third-person narrator primarily follows the experiences of Gabriel Utterson, who was a lawyer. Utterson cavorts around the city with his cousin, Richard Enfield, who is also upper class. These men socialise with the two doctors in the story, Henry Jekyll and Hasty Lanyon. Together, these men form London's professional high society. They work, of course, but socialising is in some respects their real profession. Edward Hyde, however, is decidedly a representation of the lower class. He is a brute, small, and remarkably strong, as if he had physically laboured his entire life. He is also uneducated in nature and seems to satisfy all his desires of violence and probably sex. High Victorian society was very worried about the degeneration of the human species. Since the Victorians were so concerned with progress, the plight of the poor and the offences of criminals made it seem like progress had stagnated. Hyde represents this fear. What is interesting, however, is that Hyde is part of Jekyll. Stevenson thus struggles that there is a Hyde in every Jekyll, that there is not so much of a separation between the classes as there seems to be. So interestingly, because Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are actually the same person, what the author is getting at is that there's actually an inner Hyde in all of us. So what seems to be like the sociable, educated doctor on the outside might actually be violent on the inside. Okay, so that is our lesson for today. Just a quick summary. The Victorian period was defined by industry and progress, but it was also defined by separate spheres. Those between men and women and the rich and the poor. Jekyll and Hyde, a 19th century Gothic novel, represents the latter separation, which was the rich and the poor. That between the rich and educated Jekyll and the poor and brutish Hyde. But by doubling these characters, Stevenson suggests that the separation might not actually exist. Thanks so much for listening today. If you've got any questions or comments, just write them below, and I hope you have a really nice day.